wife's death. Eleanor Roosevelt says the story's over, she's doing no more. But President Truman very much wanted her in his administration. She was very much a part of the Democratic leadership, and he offers her a position to be a delegate to the United Nations. She at first says absolutely not, she couldn't do that, she's not qualified, and friends and family talk her into accepting. Much has been written about her role at the United Nations and with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What's dropped out of history is the incredible role that the labor movement had at the UN and with the Declaration and working with Eleanor. On April 25th, 1945, delegates to the San Francisco Conference began deliberations, and they opened it up, and 40 non-governmental organizations were present at that meeting. They then proceeded to meet with the Secretary of State, and it was Phil Murray, by then president of the CIO after John L. Lewis resigned. And he said that he represented all of labor when he gave his full support to including human rights not into the UN Charter and including a commission, establishing a commission on human rights. And I will tell you that the AFL and the CIO did not agree on much in 1947, and Phil Murray couldn't say that about very many things. But it went on from there, and when the Human Rights Commission was set up and the Economic and Social Council created 7 positions for NGOs. They were called consultative positions. They could put items on the agenda, they could speak at meetings, they could do everything but vote on the final documents. 3 of those groups were trade unions. It was the AFL, it was the World Federation of Trade Unions, where the CIO took a strong leadership position, and the International Confederation of Christian Trade Unions, which was a European union group. Who knew the 3 out of the 7 most influential groups at the United Nations with labor movements? There's a big book on NGOs in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's about 600 pages. The story about Phil Murray is on page 16. The unions are not mentioned again in that volume. But the AFL actually hired a woman named Toni Sender, and she was their full-time representative at the United Nations to work on these issues. And again, the AFL and CIO didn't work on much together, but they both worked with Eleanor to get workers' rights into that document. They set up the commission, she was asked to chair it, and I like to say that just as Lincoln orchestrated a team of political rivals, she guided a complex international team of philosophers, lawyers, politicians, diplomats, and trade unionists. And she worked closely with her union friends, now including Jim Carrey, young president of the International Union of Electrical Workers. And while fighting against the anti-union Taft-Hartley law at home, she is championing workers' rights in the international frame. And Article 23 declares that everyone without discrimination has the right to a decent job, fair working conditions, a living wage, equal pay for equal work, and we heard that we're not quite there yet, and the right to form and join a union. The General Assembly passed the Declaration on December 10th, 1948, 48 votes in favor, none opposed. And the Declaration has become a central part of the powerful human rights movement today. In many places around the world, not so much here in the United States. We didn't sign the Covenant on Political and Civil Rights until 1992, and we still have not signed the Covenant on Social and Economic Rights, along with Iran, and I think 2 other countries. We're in very dubious company here. When collective bargaining expanded to include health and pensions, Eleanor Roosevelt approved, although she and Walter Reuther preferred a system of national health care. Does this sound familiar? Reuther only negotiated health insurance into the 1952 auto worker contract because he and Phil Murray thought that the employers would so object to this that they would get on board for national health care. The costs were so low then that it didn't work. They said, okay, fine. And, you know, that was sort of, once it was in there, it wasn't going to come out again. I'd like to point out that in 1955, Eleanor Roosevelt was a keynote speaker at the merger convention between the AFL and the CIO. And we actually have a video of that, which I am trying to get up on my webpage, because it's just, you know, she left a political luncheon for Adlai Stevenson to come and address the workers. And there were, I think it was 2,000 delegates at this convention and 4,000 visitors and press. Life magazine used to have a page a week devoted to the labor movement and what they were doing. She continued to criticize publicly and privately when she didn't like what the unions were doing, thought they weren't living up to their ideals. She called it an end to corruption within the unions and an end to racial discrimination within the labor movement, and it was rampant within the labor movement. She did not hesitate to criticize them and to push them on these issues. She remained very actively engaged as her health began to deteriorate in the 1950s. She worked wholeheartedly for Stevenson in 52, 56, and 60. She didn't like John Kennedy. When Profiles in Courage came out, she commented that she thought it was long on profiles and short on courage. She partly just thought he wasn't serious. She thought he had been very weak in his opposition to Joe McCarthy, that he was not a leader on racial issues. She was mindful of his religion. She was not anti-Catholic, but she thought it was going to be a problem, and indeed it was. And she really didn't like his father, who had served in FDR's administration. And so she worked her heart out for Stevenson in 1960. But when Kennedy got the nomination, he knew he needed her help. And candidate Kennedy makes a trip to Hyde Park to meet with the Grand Dame of the Democratic Party. She's impressed with that discussion. All of her union friends are now on board with Kennedy, and that's also an interesting story. She is impressed with how he grows during the campaign, and she actively campaigns for him in the fall. And when he is elected, she goes to his inauguration but declines to sit in the presidential box. She's wrapped in blankets sitting out in the bleachers. And she is so impressed with his speech and his call to the young people of the country. And it really does give her great hope. And she agrees, she joins with Walter Reuther to be advisors to the Peace Corps, because that is their economic aid, their non-military position that they've supported for years. And finally, Kennedy invites her to chair the President's Commission on the Status of Women, the first ever such commission. And her health is really declining at this point, but it's led by Esther Peterson, a wonderful labor activist, and her life comes full circle. She agrees to chair the commission. She also goes to meet with President Kennedy. She interviews him on her television show, sends him letters, and she went to the Oval Office with 3 typed pages of names of women that he should be considering to appoint in his administration, just as she had done with her husband, and just as she had done with Harry Truman. Let me just turn for a minute, and then I want to get your questions, and I'm sure there's an Eleanor Roosevelt story here in the room. But I want to talk just a minute about Wisconsin, and about Michigan, and about the public sector unions today, and how Eleanor Roosevelt's voice, I think, can be part of that debate. And the right is saying quite loudly that FDR opposed public sector unions. And there's a quote from a letter he wrote that says he is troubled by public sector unions. So we know they must be bad if FDR, the shining liberal, said they were bad. As usual, the Republicans have taken things out of time and context. FDR was very concerned about public sector unions and how you could adapt the industrial union model or the craft union model onto the public sector, because it wasn't the same. And indeed, it is developed in where they didn't just adapt the industrial model onto the public sector. They had to make changes. But Eleanor struggles with this question herself, and you can follow it in her newspaper column, because she questions, what happens if the firefighters go on strike? What happens if teachers, are not in the classroom? And she struggles with it not because she doesn't think workers should have protection, but maybe public sector could have something different from a traditional union. And we go back to legislation and unionization as the way to protect workers. And I think it was very interesting, after her, a year after FDR died, her column on April 16th, 1946, she talks about how people, and she said, no matter how devoted they were to a man or a leader, they can carry on a program by simply doing what they think that man would have done.